In the last lesson, we were introduced to variables, how we can set variables. Now, when we are setting variables, there are a few things to keep in mind. So typically, we do like to keep names short, so you don't want to have a huge long name, so you don't want to have something like what is your name question and so on. So actually you can't have spaces in between there either. So that's another thing to keep in mind with when you're setting your variable. Don't put any spaces, and if you do have something, then typically we do camel case, so every time we have a new word in here, so we capitalize that. So it makes it more readable when you're coming back into, or if another web developer is looking at your code, that they can better understand that this is what you're trying to look for and what you're trying to set the variable name is. But still, better yet, just keep it simple, straightforward, but also try to keep it relevant to what you're doing and what the value is that it's going to be holding. Also, make sure that you're not starting with a number, so you can only start out with letters, and you can also start it with a $sign. You can also start it with an underscore, but you can't start it with any other characters. So just those two characters. So it can start out with the $sign, it can start out with a number, and it can start out with any letter. So you can't start with a numeric. You can also you've got to be wary of the fact that JavaScript is case sensitive, so str with an uppercase is not the same with str with a lowercase. So case sensitive, and also don't use reserved words such as, so if you had something where a reserved name is, then keep mindful of the fact that JavaScript still does reserve some of the names. So you don't want to be overriding any of the default values that might be sitting within JavaScript. So when you're doing your naming, then make sure that you're not naming anything that you would see within JavaScript elsewhere. And with numbers, you can actually place numbers within the string, but it just can't start with a number. So those are also available when you are creating your values for your variable names. So next, we want to look at the operators. So there's different types of operators here, and we see that in order to declare a value, we're just equaling it to 1. So this is the same thing that if we did declaring a value of 5 or something like that, and we did 1 plus 4, so this would be equal to 5. So this is another way that we can have an operator in there. So we can do plus signs, we can also do minus signs, so we could have variable 6 is equal to, and see these variable names, you can call them whatever you want, that just makes sense. So I'm just doing something here where maybe we've got a value of 9 minus 3, so I'm going to keep that spacing in there and have that equal to 6. And additionally, we can do mathematics, so we can do a multiplication and so on. So all of these are valid operators, any ones that you would typically see within the math. So plus, minus, multiplication, division, and division is actually done with the slash like this. So now if we want to see the value of 6 within the console, so I'm going to just put that in there and just show you how this is going to work. So now when we refresh it, we should get rid of this prompt, but we see that JavaScript can calculate out the mathematical value and it outputs it there for us to be able to digest. Also, I'm going to actually get rid of this prompt here so that we don't have that popping up every time we're refreshing the page. So by default, if we don't actually declare anything, so if I have a value of 7, and if I just close off that statement, so what do you think is going to happen here? Because I haven't actually declared any value for 7, but I've set up that there is a variable named 7. And as opposed to if I had console log and if I did something like 8, where I haven't actually declared anything. So what do you think is going to happen at this point when we refresh it and we look in the console? So 7 I've declared, but I've not given any value. 8 I haven't declared, and it doesn't have any value. So let's check this out and see what actually gets output in our console. So we see that because 7 is declared, we get a return value of undefined. So basically that means that we haven't defined a value for this container, for this variable, but when we try to reference 8, we see that it is not defined. So undefined and not defined are two different things, because not defined is that we haven't defined 8 as an actual variable. So JavaScript comes to 8 and has no idea what it is, has no idea how to handle it, throws this X error, which is important error to make sure that you don't have any of these. But these ones up here where it's undefined, these are not as severe of errors, and that's why it's not there in red, because we have done the proper structure where we have created a holder, a container for 7, we just haven't given it anything to hold within there. So if you're looking to see if a value is, if a value comes back undefined, then you know that you need to have that the variable is there, but you haven't added any values into it. Now, you're probably wondering that, okay, so we saw that we can add in the values together, but down here we looked at and we had the plus sign, and it was actually strings that we were adding together. So you might be wondering, well, what happens if I've got, so I'm just going to do an X, Y, and a Z. So I've got X already over there, so variable Y, and you're probably wondering, well, what if I have a string value here, and if I add it to another string, we see that what happens in this case is that we add them and concatenate them together. So I'm going to show you how the output for that looks. But what do you think happens if I do a string, and let's say I do an integer, a number here? So what do you think is going to happen with Y, and what do you think is going to happen with Z? And let's open up our, and actually there's going to be one more that I want to take a look at. So what happens, what do you think if happens if I do X equals 1 and then equals plus 1? So what do you think the value of these are going to be within the console? So first of all, we've got X there. I'm going to just move a few things around to group these together a little bit better. So now we can look at our values here. So we've got a string plus a number. And what do you think the output there is going to be for X? Do you think it's going to be 2? Do you think it's going to be 11 or 1 and 1? What do you think is going to be here? String plus another. So this is going to be a new string called string another, holding that value. And this one, string and then plus 1. So what do you think is going to be here? So this is string space 1, or how do you think this is going to get treated? So let's open up our browser, refresh it, and we see that the first one, whenever we've got a string and a number, it doesn't actually add them together. So it doesn't return back 2, but it takes and converts it into a string, adding it, concatenating both of those strings together, so returning 11. Other thing over here as well, so we've got string another, notice the space in there, and it's concatenated those together. And then lastly, so we've got string space 1, and this is the value here that's being represented. So notice that I did add in the spacing here, and it is taking all of that spacing, and when it does add them together, it keeps both of those spaces as well. So do take some time and take a look at variables, because this is at the very core of JavaScript. Understanding how we can hold values and then use these values within our script is essential and very, very important. So one last one here that I want to just illustrate. So variable, and I'm going to do 5 plus the return value of 3. So this should be 8. So now we're going to have a value for 8. So I can add 5 plus 6, and do you think I'm going to get a value of 8 here? So I know 5 plus 6 isn't 8, but remember again, we're using variables. So variable is holding a value of 5, and this value of 6 is actually holding a value of 3. So let's see what happens now when we render this out, and let's console log out a value for 8 as well. And let's refresh that, and now we see that we've got an integer value of 8. So because this is still numeric, all the values coming in there was numeric, so it stayed as numeric, and the other ones are still the same there. And it is important to understand how all of these values work together. So do take some time and try it out. So if we had variable 7 and equals plus x plus y, and then we can console log out z. And here you can try out different things and see what the end result here is. So we've got console log of 5, and now I can do a 6, I can do divided by 5, and so on. So we see we got decimal places there. So if this one is now 4, we see that all the different values, 1.2, 4, and so on. So there's quite a lot we can do, and it's definitely worthwhile playing around with this and getting yourself really familiar how variables work, because it's going to be a crucial step in understanding JavaScript.